When I was sorting through my late husband's home office, I found a locked tin box pushed to the back of the bottom drawer, behind 30 years of tax files and a broken stapler. On the lid, in my husband's careful handwriting, for Miriam. Not for our son to see. I stood there in the quiet of that room for a long time, holding it with both hands. Good day, everyone. It's Donna here. I'm glad you found your way to this story. Please stay with me to the end and let me know in the comments which city or province you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. My husband Clifford and I had been married for 38 years. We met in the fall of 1983 at a community skating rink in Sudbury, Ontario. He was there with his brother, wearing a burgundy hockey jacket that was slightly too short in the sleeves, and he skated like someone who had grown up on a backyard rink, which, as it turned out, he had. He asked me if I wanted a hot chocolate from the concession stand. I said yes. That was essentially the whole story of how it started. Clifford was a quiet man, not cold, never cold. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who has thought a thing through before he says it. He worked for over 30 years as a structural engineer with a firm in Sudbury, steady and methodical in everything he did. I was a school librarian for 24 years until the district reorganized and my position was dissolved. We were comfortable the way most people our age in Northern Ontario were comfortable. We owned our home outright, had modest RRSPs, took the occasional trip to visit my sister in Halifax. Nothing extravagant. A good life. An ordinary, decent life. Clifford died the previous February. A stroke. He had been showing small signs for months, things I had chalked up to age and fatigue, and then one Tuesday morning he was gone. My son Gareth was there by that afternoon, driving up from Toronto with his wife Lynette. I was grateful for that, or I thought I was. The grief in the early weeks was the kind that fills a house. Every room I walked into had something of his in it. His reading glasses on the kitchen counter, his boots by the door. I moved carefully through those first months, trying not to disturb the shape of things too much. It was in late April, about 10 weeks after the funeral, that I finally allowed myself to go through his office properly. Clifford had been organized about most things. His bookshelves were alphabetical. His files were labeled in his neat block printing. I was going through the bottom drawer of his old oak desk when I found it, pushed behind a thick folder of utility receipts from the 1990s. A small tin box, the kind that once held shortbread cookies at Christmas. It had a simple latch with a small padlock, and there was a key taped to the underside of the lid with a square of yellowed tape. My name on the lid, and that instruction beneath it, not for our son to see. I should tell you that by that point, Gareth and Lynette had already begun. It had started politely enough, the way it always starts. Gareth mentioned twice, once by phone and once over dinner in March, that he and Lynette were carrying a significant mortgage in Toronto and that things were tight. He mentioned that Dad had always talked about wanting to help the family when the time came. Lynette had suggested with a warm smile that I might want to think about my options now that I was on my own, that a smaller place might be easier to manage, that she knew a very good real estate agent who specialized in helping seniors transition. That word, transition. I'd nodded and said I would think about it, which I had no intention of doing, but I had given them the benefit of the doubt. Grief makes people strange and greedy in ways they wouldn't ordinarily be. I knew that. I told myself that. And now I was standing in Clifford's office with a tin box in my hands that my husband of 38 years had specifically asked me not to share with our son. I did not open it there. I took it to the kitchen table, made a pot of tea I barely tasted, and sat down with the winter light coming through the back window. The key fit. The latch clicked open. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and beneath it, a small envelope, and beneath that, a USB drive in a plastic sleeve with a single handwritten label, Miriam only, bank documents, and letter. I read the folded note first. It was brief, written in Clifford's careful way, the way he wrote everything important deliberately, without wasted words. Miriam, everything in here is yours. There is a second account at Northland Credit Union on Large Street. Ask for Diane Pelletier. She has been expecting you. Please speak to a lawyer before you speak to Gareth. I should have told you sooner. I am sorry it took me this long to be certain. I love you. C. I read it twice. Then I sat for a long time listening to the furnace kick on and the distant sound of a snowplow 2 streets over. A second account. Clifford had an account at a credit union I had never heard him mention in my name, and there was someone there waiting for me. I did not sleep well that night. I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling and went through everything I thought I knew. Our joint checking at TD, the RRSPs we had both contributed to, the life insurance I had already filed, all accounted for, all straightforward. Clifford had handled our finances the way he handled everything, carefully and without drama. There had never been a reason to question it. But now there was a USB drive on my nightstand. I got up before 5 and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the note open in front of me and thought about Gareth. My son was 49, broad-shouldered like his father, with none of his father's patience. As a boy, he had been genuinely sweet. He calls on birthdays. He cried at his grandfather's funeral in a way that made me love him more fiercely than I already did. But something had shifted in his mid-30s, some time after he married Lynette. She was not a cruel woman exactly. She was a practical one. She had grown up in a household where money was always discussed as something scarce and strategic, and she had never quite stopped approaching it that way. Over the years, I had watched her slowly recalibrate my son's priorities, his language, his loyalties. He no longer called just to call. He called when something needed to happen. I hated thinking this. I hated that a locked tin box was forcing me to count up things I had quietly set aside for years. But here was the count. Since Clifford's death, Gareth had asked me 3 times about the will. He had used the word estate as though we lived on a country property in Muskoka rather than a 3-bedroom house in Sudbury. He had mentioned twice that he had spoken to a financial planner, who suggested that consolidating assets was wise for a widow in her 60s. He had offered, through Lynette, to connect me with a notary Lynette's firm used, someone who could walk me through my options. Each offer framed as care, each one landing like a hand testing a door. I thought, he doesn't know about the account, but he suspects there is something to find. By 6 in the morning, I had made 3 decisions. The first was that I would go to Northland Credit Union alone, as soon as it opened, and ask for Diane Pelletier. I would not mention the visit to Gareth or to Lynette. The second was that I would call my own lawyer, a woman named Claire Bergstrom, who had handled our wills years ago and who I trusted entirely. A sharp, unhurried woman who worked out of a small office on Elm Street and who had given me sound advice every time I had needed it. The third decision was quieter and harder. I would not tell Gareth anything until I understood what I was dealing with. I would be warm when he called. I would be the grieving mother he expected, but I would not be an open door. Was that a kind of deception? Perhaps. But Clifford had kept a secret for reasons I did not yet understand, and he had asked me specifically to keep it too. He had loved Gareth. He had still written not for our son to see. That sentence told me more than the rest of the note combined. I dressed carefully that morning. Good slacks, a proper blouse. I took the USB drive and tucked it into the inside zip pocket of my purse. Then I waited for 9 o'clock. Northland Credit Union on Larch Street was a small, unhurried branch, the kind of place where people knew each other by name, and the teller asked about your winter. I asked for Diane Pelletier at the front desk and watched the young man's expression shift slightly, not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the look of someone who has been told to expect a particular visitor. He said he would let her know I was there. Diane Pelletier was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair and the calm, direct manner of someone who spent her working life handling other people's most private matters with discretion. She shook my hand and led me back to a small office that smelled of coffee and clean carpet. She closed the door. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "I'm glad you came. Clifford said it might take you a few months." "You knew him?" He opened the account here 9 years ago. He came in regularly, once or twice a year. She folded her hands on the desk. He was a reserved man, but he was very clear about his intentions every time we spoke. He trusted you completely. He said so without exception. 9 years. For 9 years, Clifford had been making quiet visits to this credit union on Larch Street, and I had not known. Diane walked me through the account. The balance was higher than anything I had expected. Clifford had been contributing steadily since 2014, routing small amounts from a separate investment account through his workplace financial planner, someone named Oliver Tran at his engineering firm, who had managed the investment side discreetly and professionally. The current balance, including a modest, non-registered investment portfolio attached to the account, was just over $312,000. I had to sit down. Diane gave me a glass of water and waited quietly while I absorbed it. Then she slid a folder across the desk. The account was in both our names, she explained, with right of survivorship. It had transferred to me automatically at the time of Clifford's death. There was no probate required. It was mine, cleanly and completely exactly as Clifford had intended. I took photographs of every document with my phone. I asked Diane to note in the credit union's records that access was mine alone. She nodded in the way of someone who had been expecting this request. I drove home on a Tuesday morning in late April with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The highway into Sudbury was slushy with late spring snow that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to do, and I remember watching the tree line and thinking about the word brave. Clifford had used it in his note. It took me this long to be certain. He hadn't said brave exactly, but I understood what he meant. He had watched something change in our son over the years, and he had acted on what he saw, quietly and carefully, the way he did everything, without drama and without apology. He had been protecting me from Gareth. Not from cruelty, exactly, but from the particular kind of harm that comes from a child who has decided that a parent's security is a resource to be managed rather than a life to be respected. That afternoon, Gareth called. His voice was light, the studied ease of someone trying not to seem impatient. He mentioned again that Lynette's notary was available anytime. He mentioned he was just keeping an eye on things and didn't want me to feel overwhelmed. I told him I appreciated it. I kept my voice warm. I was already dialing Claire Bergstrom before the call ended. Claire's office was above a printing shop on Elm Street, the kind of space where everything was slightly mismatched, but everything worked. She was 61, wore her reading glasses on a cord, and had the particular unhurried confidence of a woman who had spent decades watching people underestimate her. She was exactly right for this. I spread everything across her desk, the note from the tin box, the photographs of the credit union documents, the USB drive, which she plugged into her own laptop and reviewed in silence for several minutes, occasionally asking me a clarifying question. Then she sat back and was quiet in the way she was when she was thinking. Clifford was thorough, she said finally. He was. She tapped the folder. The account is legally yours. The survivorship designation transfers cleanly and is not subject to probate under Ontario succession law. There is no ambiguity here. He structured this carefully, Miriam. She paused. What you're describing with your son and his wife isn't a legal threat yet, but these things have a way of becoming one if you're not ahead of them. We spent 2 hours together that afternoon. By the end of it, I had a plan. Claire would ensure the investment portfolio was formally consolidated under my sole management through a financial advisor she trusted, a calm and precise man named David Ashby who worked out of a mid-sized firm downtown. She would prepare a formal record establishing that I had sought independent legal counsel and that no other party had been involved in my decisions. This last piece was the shield, she said. A paper trail showing a widow who knew exactly what she was doing and had documented every step of it. Over the following 2 weeks, I executed each piece quietly. I met with David Ashby and reviewed every account. I signed the necessary documents at Claire's office. I had the investment portfolio formally assessed and transferred. I did all of this while continuing to answer Gareth's calls, listening to his gentle suggestions, saying nothing. It was Lynette who noticed first. I should have expected that. She called on a Thursday afternoon and her voice had changed. The careful warmth was gone, replaced by something more precise. She said she had heard, she didn't say from whom, that I had visited a credit union downtown and met with an account manager. She said she and Gareth didn't want to make assumptions, but that they felt they had a right to be involved in any significant financial decisions. She used the phrase, "our family's future," twice. I kept my voice steady. I said that Clifford had left me as sole administrator of the estate and that I was handling matters with legal counsel. I said she was welcome to have her own lawyer review anything filed through the court once it was a matter of public record. 20 minutes later, Gareth called. He was less composed than Lynette. His voice had the particular tightness it gets when he feels cornered. I had heard it before when he was a teenager and I caught him in a lie, and I recognized it now for what it was. Fear dressed as anger. He said I was being secretive. He said Dad would have wanted him involved. He said Dad had promised things. I said gently, "Your father left a will, Gareth. It names me as sole beneficiary. You are welcome to verify that." There was a pause. Then he said something in a low, flat voice I had not expected. "We know there's more than what's in the will, Mum. We've been looking into it. If you're not going to be fair about this, we're going to have to raise questions about whether Dad was fully himself when he set certain things up. Mental capacity. They were going to challenge the estate on those grounds." My hands were cold. My voice was not. "Claire Bergstrom is my lawyer," I said. "Her number is on the Law Society's public directory. Any communication from this point forward should go through her." I hung up. I won't pretend I was unafraid. I sat at the kitchen table afterward for a very long time, and I cried, not from weakness, but from the particular grief of watching your child become someone you cannot quite recognize. The boy who had cried at his grandfather's funeral, who called on birthdays, somewhere in there was still the person I had raised, and whatever Lynette had shaped him into since, that boy was still somewhere underneath it, looking out through eyes that had forgotten who they belonged to. The fear was real, but beneath it was something harder, the memory of Clifford's note. It took me this long to be certain. He had been afraid too for years, apparently, and he had still done the careful, right thing. I could do no less. Claire was calm when I called her. "A capacity challenge without medical evidence is nearly unwinnable," she said, "and we have documentation that would make even a well-supported challenge difficult." She told me to document all contact from Gareth and Lynette going forward and to let everything go through her from now on. I gave myself a week. I drove to Halifax to stay with my sister Noreen. We walked the waterfront in the evenings, wrapped up against the April wind off the harbor. We ate too much and stayed up too late, and I let myself be someone's little sister for a few days instead of a widow managing a siege. It helped more than I expected. When I came back, I was ready. The first sign of a changed approach arrived 4 days after I returned. A flower arrangement, pale pink tulips and white freesias from a florist in the Kingsway. The card read, "Mom, we love you. We've been handling this badly. Can we start again? Gareth and Lynette." I set the flowers on the counter and looked at them for a while. Lynette called that evening. Her voice was soft again, reconstructed into warmth. She said they had been under tremendous stress. She said losing Clifford had hit Gareth harder than he showed anyone. She said she was sorry for the things that had been said, that they'd both been out of line. She asked if I would come for dinner on the weekend. Just the three of us. Just to clear the air. She said there was certainly enough for everyone, and that there was no reason for things to be contentious. She was careful not to use the word money. She didn't need to. Enough for everyone. There it was. The flowers were a down payment on a different kind of conversation, one where I would sit at their table in Toronto and be gently, lovingly pressed toward sharing what Clifford had legally and deliberately left to me alone. I thanked her for the tulips. I said I needed more time. I kept my voice warm and impossible to argue with. When I set the phone down, I felt something I had not expected. Clarity, not the anxious, effortful kind, but the quiet, settled kind that comes when you have stopped hoping a situation will resolve on its own and have accepted that you are the one who will resolve it. I called people. I called my neighbor Janet Sweeney, who had been leaving groceries on my step since the funeral, and whom I had been politely deflecting. I called my friend Barbara O'Coffer, who had been widowed 4 years earlier and understood certain things without needing them explained. I called Reverend Paul at my church, not for spiritual guidance exactly, but for the simple comfort of someone whose motives I trusted entirely. And I called my granddaughter Caitlin, Gareth, and Lynette's daughter, 23 years old and living in Ottawa, who had sent me a quiet text 3 weeks earlier. Grandma, I don't know what's going on, but I'm here if you need me. Whatever it is. I had not called Caitlin because I hadn't wanted to put her in the middle, but her text had stayed with me. It told me that whatever was happening in that household, it was not unanimous. She picked up on the second ring. We talked for almost an hour. She was careful, the way young people are when they love both sides of a conflict. She didn't criticize her parents directly, but she confirmed, in the quiet way of someone choosing words precisely, that there had been a significant amount of conversation in her parents' house about what Grandpa had left behind, and that she had not been comfortable with what she was hearing. She said she was glad I called. I told her I wasn't asking her to take sides, just to stay in my life. She said she wasn't going anywhere. Janet came over for tea twice that week. Barbara and I walked the Ramsey Lake Trail on a Wednesday morning while the ice was still going out. Reverend Paul stopped by Friday afternoon with a container of soup from the church. None of these people knew the details, but their presence reminded me that I was not isolated, not alone, not the thing Lynette had apparently calculated me to be. The capacity challenge was filed with the Ontario Superior Court on a Monday morning in June. Claire called me before I'd finished my coffee to tell me it had arrived, and she sounded the way she always sounded, precise and faintly satisfied, like someone watching a chess piece move to exactly the square she had anticipated. They filed a petition alleging that Clifford had experienced cognitive decline in his final years, and that certain financial arrangements, specifically the credit union account and the investment portfolio, had been established in a state of diminished capacity. They were asking for redistribution of the estate under intestate succession rules, which under Ontario law would result in a significant portion going to Gareth. "What's our position?" I asked, though I already knew. "Strong," Claire said. "Very strong." Our response package was comprehensive. It included Clifford's medical records from his final 3 years, records which showed cognitive assessments performed by both his cardiologist and his family physician, neither of whom had found any evidence of impairment. It included a letter from Diane Pelletier at Northland Credit Union, who had met with Clifford regularly for 9 years, and who stated clearly that she had observed no confusion, no unusual behavior, no indication of any diminished capacity across the entire period of their professional relationship. It included records from Oliver Tran, Clifford's financial planner at the engineering firm, who confirmed that the investment decisions had been made systematically and deliberately over nearly a decade, with consistent strategy and clear intent. It also included something else. Lynette had made an error. In her earlier conversations with the family mediator she had engaged before the formal legal proceedings began, she had sent several emails outlining her approach. Those emails had been forwarded, inadvertently, to someone with professional ties to someone in Claire's network. Claire told me they had been obtained through proper channels. That was sufficient for me. What the emails contained was Lynette's own voice, before the tulips, before the warm phone calls, before the careful dinner invitation. In one, she described the credit union account as the asset we need to secure before she lawyers up fully. In another, she referred to me as a woman on her own at 64 who doesn't fully understand what she's sitting on. There was a third in which she outlined a plan to use the mediator to bring me to the table informally and create an agreement before I had independent legal advice. I read those emails once, then I set them down. I did not cry. I had nothing left to spend on Lynette's private assessment of me. What I felt was something closer to the click of a lock closing. The sound of a thing being exactly what it had always been, now confirmed. The morning of the hearing I dressed carefully. Good wool blazer, proper trousers, The small gold earrings Clifford had given me for our 30th anniversary. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman of 64 who understood precisely what she was doing. The courtroom was quiet and procedural in the way these hearings tend to be. No jury, no gallery. Just the judge, the lawyers, the court reporter, and us. Gareth and Lynette were already seated when I arrived, their lawyer between them like a seam. Gareth looked at me when I walked in. For a moment his face was unreadable, something moving behind it that I couldn't name. Then he looked away. Lynette did not look at me at all. Claire presented our case with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times and needed nothing to perform. She walked the judge through the medical documentation, through Diane Pelletier's letter, through Oliver Tran's records, through the internal consistency and precision of every financial decision Clifford had made across the final decade of his life. She was methodical and unhurried. A person experiencing cognitive decline does not maintain a disciplined investment strategy for 9 years. Anyone who looked at the documentation would understand that immediately. Then she introduced the emails. Lynette's lawyer asked for a recess the moment they appeared. The judge granted 10 minutes. I sat still during that recess and watched the composed front across the room develop a crack. Lynette was speaking to her lawyer in a low, rapid voice, her hand making tight, controlled movements. Gareth was not looking at anyone. He was sitting very still in the way people sit when something inside them has gone quiet. Not calm, emptied. I recognized that stillness. I had felt it myself, standing in Clifford's office, holding a tin box I hadn't yet opened. When the hearing resumed, Lynette's lawyer requested a continuance to review new materials. The judge denied it. Gareth took the stand briefly. Claire asked him about specific conversations he had claimed demonstrated his father's confusion. She asked him to date those conversations precisely. She asked him to describe them in specific detail. He couldn't. Not because he had fabricated everything. I believe his memories of his father being tired and slower at the end were genuine. But Lynette had built a legal argument on what were in truth the ordinary difficult days of a man with a weakening heart, not cognitive decline. Under cross-examination, those days collapsed back to their actual size. At one point, Gareth said, "I just felt like Dad wasn't himself near the end." Claire asked gently, "Did you raise concerns about your father's mental state with any of his physicians while he was alive?" A pause. "No," Gareth said. "Did you contact his cardiologist or his family doctor at any point with those concerns?" "No." "Did you mention these concerns to your mother during your father's illness?" A longer pause. I watched my son's jaw move in the way it does when he is deciding whether to tell the truth. "No," he said. "So these concerns about your father's mental capacity arose after his death," Claire said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "Thank you," Claire said. "Nothing further." The judge ruled that afternoon. The petition was denied in its entirety. Clifford's estate remained exactly as filed, solely in my name, exactly as he had intended. The judge noted in his brief remarks that the evidence of Clifford Caldwell's mental acuity was thorough and consistent, and that the petition had been inadequately supported and was undermined by the timing and circumstances of its filing. That phrase, "the timing and circumstances," was a small, precise observation. I suspected Lynette understood it more fully than anyone else in the room. Claire shook my hand in the corridor afterward briefly and firmly. I thanked her. Then I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat and let myself exhale. A long, slow exhale that had been waiting months to happen. Outside the window, the June afternoon was bright and ordinary. Pigeons on the courthouse steps, someone eating lunch on a bench, the world entirely indifferent to verdicts. I drove home. There was nothing dramatic about it. That was the right way for this chapter to end. The following weeks brought consequences that arrived quietly and without my involvement. The emails were now part of the public court record, referenced by the judge in his remarks. Lynette worked as a senior project manager at a consulting firm in Toronto. Within the professional world of a mid-sized city, word travels along the kinds of connections people don't always notice until they're working in their favor or against them. Within 6 weeks of the ruling, I heard, through Barbara, who heard from someone else, that Lynette had been placed on a performance review. By August, she had moved into a different role at a smaller firm. Whether this was directly connected to the court record or simply to the impression the emails had made in the right professional circles, I cannot say for certain. I noted it with the specific sadness I had come to associate with everything Lynette related. I had never wanted her humiliated. I had only ever wanted what Clifford had left me. That those two things were connected was her doing, not mine. Gareth called me once, about 2 weeks after the hearing. It was the hardest phone call of everything, harder in some ways than the calls in which he had threatened me. He was not angry. He was something worse. Deflated. His voice sounded like itself for the first time in years, without the layered strategic quality that Lynette's influence had added to it over a long time. He sounded the way he had sounded as a younger man, before all of it. He said he was sorry. He said he had let someone else do his thinking for him and that he knew that wasn't an excuse. He said he had been thinking about his father, about who his father actually was, and that he had spent years seeing his father through a lens that had been handed to him, and that he was trying now to look without the lens. I listened to all of it. I let him speak until he had said everything he needed to say. There is a particular patience that comes with being someone's mother for a long time, the kind that can hold a long silence without trying to fill it. "I know," I said when he finished. "Are we okay?" he asked. The question was small and unguarded. I heard my son in it, the one who had cried at his grandfather's funeral. "We're not okay yet," I said carefully, "but I'm not finished with you. Do you understand what I mean by that?" There was a long pause. "Yes," he said. "Then give it time," I said, "and please go speak to someone. Not a mediator, a proper therapist, someone who will tell you the truth." He said he would. He said it without performance. Whether he did, at that point, was his own business. I had said what was mine to say. The financial matters closed out cleanly. David Ashby managed the portfolio consolidation without a single complication. The investment accounts were fully transferred into my sole management by September. Claire sent a final invoice and a short handwritten note that said simply, "He trusted the right person." I framed it and put it on the bookshelf in the living room. By fall, I had begun to recognize my life again. Not the life I had with Clifford, which was gone and irreplaceable, but the life that remained, which turned out to be quite a lot. I booked a trip to Cape Breton with Noreen. We drove the Cava Trail in October when the colors were at their peak, stopping when we wanted, eating chowder at small restaurants along the coast. I stood at the top of the Cavett Trail lookout on a clear afternoon and felt, for the first time in more than a year, something like uncomplicated pleasure. The particular feeling of being somewhere beautiful with nothing requiring your attention but the view. I had the back deck repaired and repainted, something Clifford had been meaning to do for 3 summers. A sage green that looked exactly right against the house. I joined a Thursday evening book club at the public library, something I had been putting off for years. I was not the best reader in the room. I went every week anyway. Caitlin came for Thanksgiving. She drove in from Ottawa with a bottle of Ontario wine and the particular quality of attention that young people rarely give to older ones when they're not preoccupied with their own lives. We cooked together. We talked for a long time about nothing that mattered and several things that did. She told me carefully, without editorializing, that her parents had separated. I listened without comment. I felt the sadness of it. 2 people discovering that choices accumulate. Gareth's calls, by November, had begun to sound more like my son again. He was in therapy. He was not asking for anything. He called on Sundays and sometimes just to say he had been thinking about his father, a memory that came up, a thing he wanted to say out loud to someone who also remembered Clifford that way. I answered those calls. I would keep answering them. I won't tie that neatly. Rebuilding looks like a long series of ordinary Sunday phone calls that accumulate slowly, over a long time, into something that might eventually resemble trust. On the first Sunday of December, I sat in Clifford's chair in the living room with a cup of tea and the tin box open on the table beside me. I read his note again, the short, careful note I had now read dozens of times. I should have told you sooner. I was wrong to wait. I thought about a man who had carried something invisible for 9 years, who had driven to a credit union on Larch Street once or twice a year, sat across from Diane Pelletier, and built something quietly and without drama, who had trusted, after 38 years of knowing exactly who I was, that I would know what to do with it. He had been right, eventually. I closed the note, put it back in the tin box, and latched it closed. Outside the window, the first real snow of December was coming down, steady and quiet, the kind that settles without fuss and stays. I thought about what Clifford had understood that I had needed time to learn, that grief is not weakness, that being alone does not mean being without resources, that anyone who looks at a woman in her 60s who has just lost her husband and sees an opportunity has fundamentally misread what loss actually does to a person. It does not soften you, it clarifies you. Walter had been brave enough to protect me. I was brave enough to honor it. If this story reached you where you are, please leave a comment and let me know what city or province you're writing from. And if you've ever had to be braver than you expected, leave that in the comments too. I'd like to know. I still think about that Tuesday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table before the sun was fully up, reading Clifford's note in the low light. He had written it carefully, the way he did everything, and he had carried it alone for 9 years. 9 years of quiet trips to a credit union on Larch Street, of careful decisions made without drama, of watching something change in our son and choosing to respond not with confrontation, but with preparation. He had done the right thing, the only way he knew how. Steadily, without fuss, without leaving anything open. What happened in the months that followed was not complicated when I look back at it now. Every action produced a consequence that was entirely proportional to the intention behind it. Clifford built something honest, and it held. Lynette constructed a strategy on paper and in emails, calculating and deliberate, and when those words entered a courtroom, they described her exactly for what she was. Gareth allowed someone else to do his thinking for him, and he lost something in the process that he's only now, slowly, beginning to recover. None of this was punishment in any formal sense. It was simply the weight of choices making itself felt, the way it eventually always does. I've thought about what it actually took to get through that year, not the legal side, though, that mattered, but the inner work of it. The first thing it required was a kind of basic honesty with myself, the willingness to look at what was actually happening with my son and his wife, without the softening lens of what I wanted to be true. That is harder than it sounds. We are loyal to the people we love, and loyalty has a way of blurring what is clearly in front of us. I had been blurring it for years. When the tin box forced me to stop, I had to choose between comfortable uncertainty and uncomfortable clarity. Choosing clarity was a moral act, not a dramatic one, just a quiet decision to see the thing for what it was. The second thing it required was clear thinking under pressure. Claire Bergstrom mattered, David Ashby mattered, Diane Pelletier mattered, but none of them could have helped me if I had not first understood what I was dealing with and made the right decisions in the right order, alone, before 5 in the morning, with cold coffee and a handwritten note on the kitchen table. Understanding what documents to gather, which steps to take first, how to stay ahead of a situation that was moving fast, that required me to use my mind when I was also exhausted and grieving and frightened. I had always considered myself an ordinary person. I was, but ordinary people are capable of precise thinking when the moment demands it. The third thing was simply persistence, staying steady through the flowers and the warm phone calls and the carefully planned dinner invitation, staying steady through the threat, taking a week in Halifax and coming back ready, not performing courage but actually finding it, one quiet decision at a time, in the same kitchen where I had read Clifford's note, at the same table where we had shared 38 years of ordinary mornings. Clifford trusted me with open eyes. He had known me for nearly 4 decades, and he had made a considered judgment about who I was and what I would do. I think about that often. It is one of the most sustaining things anyone has ever given me, not the money, the trust. I intend to be worthy of it for whatever years I have left.